Have you ever wondered why so many runners hit the wall chasing a sub 4 hour marathon? It's not just about training more, it's about training smarter, nailing your pacing, and fueling right. And if it's your first marathon, or if you're wondering how to crack that 4 hour barrier, this video is for you. I'm Russ, a 2:42 marathoner from Sydney earlier this year. I've helped tons of runners hit their marathon time goals. And I'm going to make things crystal clear so that when you're standing on that start line, you'll have the confidence to know that you're going to run under 4 hours, even before you've run it. We're going to keep things as simple as possible and cover all the bases, so strap in. We're going to cover the mindset that you need to make sub 4 hours happen, a little bit of the light science as to how your body will actually do it, and trust me, you need to know that, what the training involves, and then how to tackle race day. And finally, we'll cover some fueling and hydration. If you stick around until the end, I promise that you'll realize it's easier than you think, and that sub 4 hours is for everyone and not just those faster runners. It just needs a few shifts, and the first one is all in your mind. I like to call it the preparation mindset. So to run sub 4, you need to average 9:09 a mile for 26.2 miles or 5:41 a kilometer for 42.2 kilometers. And the average finish time now in the male category is 4 hours 24 minutes, and in the female category is 4 hours 51. And in fact, less than 30% of marathon finishers actually break 4 hours. And that number drops even further for first-time marathoners. Hopefully that goes to show that very few, if any, can just turn up on the day and wing a sub 4 hour marathon without doing some pretty significant training. It also means that breaking 4 hours will require a consistent, structured training block between 12 to 16 weeks, depending on your starting point. And that means making running a priority in your week and not just fitting it in when your life allows. For a few months, it will feel like a mindset and lifestyle shift, but it's only for a few months if you fully commit. You'll be thinking ahead about when you're running, you'll be planning long runs on your weekends, you'll be more conscious about your sleep, your recovery, and how you're feeling day to day. But that's exactly why it works. And sub 4, it isn't rare because it's impossible. It's rare because most people underestimate how intentional you actually need to be about it. When I decided that I was going to commit to marathons, I really struggled to be able to compare where I was with my other race times to see how quick I could actually run the marathon. So I've actually created an AI tool that you can use for free, which I'll link below. And that should help you to understand if you've got enough in that locker already before you start your marathon training. And that should be comfortable enough for me to be able to say that you'll be fit enough on race day, having done a decent block of training. Think of it as the absolute baseline fitness that you need to be able to achieve before going into a sub 4 hour training block. So as a rough guide, it's not hard and fast if you're targeting sub 4, but I'd feel much more confident if you're around that 1 hour 56-ish half marathon or below, a 52-minute 10K or below, or roughly a 25-minute 5K or park run. For those of you that can run a 25-minute 5K that think that that means that you can go out and run a sub 4 hour marathon tomorrow, think again. The calculator basically assumes that you are equally well trained across all the race distances. And trust me, it's much harder to be well trained for a marathon as opposed to a 5K. Age, weight, your sporting background, they all matter. I've seen runners outside of those ranges still go sub 4, but only when they were extremely consistent and they executed their race perfectly. The aim of your training is to get your body in shape so that sub 4 hour marathon pace sits within your aerobic zone for as long as possible before you go over your threshold and that wall starts to come closer. So let's dig a bit more into the science of it, of how your body actually runs sub 4. So a sub 4 hour marathon, and all marathons, in fact, are overwhelmingly aerobic events. So most of the race, that should live within your zone 3 and lower end of zone 4. There's a place where oxygen delivery is efficient, your fat and carbohydrate uses are balanced, and the fatigue is manageable because you're able to flush out as much lactate as your body is producing. The easiest way to think of it is that you're aiming to run the marathon with your heart rate as low as possible for as long as possible. It looks a little bit like what I managed to achieve at Sydney 26. And what you're not looking for is like what I did in my first marathon at the Gold Coast in 2025, where my heart rate was far too high for far too long, and I had to really fight hitting that wall. So it's a really practical test that I like to use to see whether or not you've got a decent enough aerobic base going into the training block, and it's this. If you can hold your goal marathon pace, about 5:41 a kilometer, 9:09 a mile, remember, for about 60 to 90 minutes in training, with your heart rate mostly sitting in zone 3 and low zone 4, which is those areas that we'd like to call your sub-threshold, then you've got a solid aerobic base to build from. The aim of the block is to stretch that out to last as long as possible and as far into the race as you can. And that aerobic base is built the boring way. Slow, steady, easy, consistent running. Slow and steady wins the race because as the race progresses, something happens to everyone, and that includes the elites as well. Even if your pace stays the same, your heart rate slowly rises and begins to what we call decouple. This is called cardiac drift. It's driven by dehydration, rise in body temperature, basically that accumulated fatigue. And at some point, you'll drift up and into and over your threshold, your lactate 2 threshold. And that's the point where lactate is produced faster than what your body can clear. And once you cross over that line, your carbohydrate use will spike, your fatigue will really accelerate, and that clock starts ticking. So once you're over that threshold, there is no coming back from that. So most runners, they can only sustain that effort above threshold for 45 to 60 minutes or so before the wheels will really start to fall off, and then bang, you'll hit the wall. And that's why poor pacing early in the race is so costly. Now, this is where threshold training comes in, because for many sub-4 runners, threshold pace will sit somewhere around that 5:10, 5:20 a kilometer, and training at or just under that effort, that pushes that threshold slightly higher and progresses it further out. So basically meaning that you can hold marathon pace longer without tipping over it. Now, a good way to think of it is that you're not actually trying to make that pace, marathon pace, faster. You're actually trying to make it seem easier. Now, there's one more factor that has a huge influence on whether marathon pace feels sustainable or feels like a grind. And that's one that often gets really misunderstood. That's your body weight. Now, I want to be really careful here because this isn't about chasing some unrealistic numbers on the scales, and it's definitely not about unhealthy weight loss. But from a pure physics and physiological standpoint, how much mass you're carrying over 26 miles or 42 kilometers, that's going to matter. A commonly accepted rule of thumb in running is that for most runners, every 1 pound of body weight equates to roughly 1 second a kilometer. So if you carry an extra 2 pounds, that's about 2 seconds a kilometer. If you're thinking metrically, that roughly works out around 2 seconds per kilogram per kilometer. Now, that might not sound like much, but if we zoom out, over a full marathon, 2 seconds a kilometer adds up to nearly a minute and a half. 5 kilometers, you're suddenly talking about 6 to 7 minutes across the whole race. And that can be the difference between running comfortably under 4 or watching your watch just tick over it. What's really important here, though, is context, because weight loss, it doesn't magically make you faster if it comes at the cost of your energy availability, your recovery, your immune system, or your just consistent training. So if you use a marathon block purely for that aggressive weight loss, it can actually lead to a worse performance, not better. Sure, you're going to lose some weight burning so many calories, but it's still hugely important to make sure that you're getting enough calories to function correctly. Where it also becomes useful is understanding where it affects your running economy, because when you improve your fitness, you build that aerobic capacity and train consistently, your body composition will often shift naturally. You'll become more efficient, you carry less like non-functioning mass, and your marathon pace actually feels easier for the same heart rate, which is the aim. That's why experienced runners, they'll never say that they dieted during the block to get faster. They will just train well, eat well, and their body will naturally adapt. So if you're carrying extra weight and you want to address it, the best time to do that is going into the block and at those early stages, not during those hardest weeks of training. Because once you're deep into that marathon prep, the priority will become making sure that you're fueling enough to support your training and to recover well and turning up to those sessions with some energy. Because while some performance gains can come from the scales, you get much more by being able to absorb that training week after week after week. So what does that training involve? If you're serious about breaking 4, you need a structured 12, ideally 16-week build. Now, for most runners, their peak weekly volume, that will land somewhere around 30 to 40 miles, so 45 to 60 kilometers, hitting the pavement 4 or 5 times a week. The exact number matters less than one thing, and that is consistency. Because your fitness, it won't come from one great week. It will come from solid stacking of back-to-back, week to week. And the backbone of your training, that should be easy running. Zone 2, conversational pace, comfortable enough that you could do it all again tomorrow. Now, this builds that aerobic base we talked about earlier, and it'll build it slowly and steadily. Now, there was a huge study using Strava data that basically showed that with recreational marathon runners, they perform better when they spend the majority of their time training at low intensity with a couple of hard sessions sprinkled on top. And that the more easy running you do, basically the faster that you'll be able to race. For most sub-4 runners, easy pace will fall somewhere between 10 and 11 minutes a mile, or 6:15 and 7 minutes a kilometer. Now, it won't feel impressive or like you're doing much initially, but trust me, over time, your heart rate will drop, your efficiency starts to improve, and that marathon pace starts to feel a lot closer to home. And on top of that, you'll want to sprinkle in 1 or 2, ideally 2 quality sessions a week. Now, that might be a VO2 max workout like 6 by 800 meters at 5K, your 5K race pace, or a threshold session, something like 3 by 10 minutes at just faster than marathon pace. Those sessions are a stimulus aimed to teach your body how to process lactate, hold form under fatigue, and stay strong when things get uncomfortable, because they really will. And then there's the long run, which is arguably, in my opinion, the most important session of the week. So gradually, you want to build those out. So 19 to 21 miles, 30 to 34 kilometers. As your fitness improves, start including sections of that at just below marathon pace, especially towards the second half of that long run. Now, those long runs are also the perfect place to be practicing your fueling, your hydration, and that your race shoes fit well and aren't going to cause you any blisters. And you can also check your planned race kit isn't going to cause any rubbing or chafing issues on the day. If there's one thing you remember though, please remember, do nothing new on race day. Everything should be packed into these long runs. Strength training matters too, and if you can, and I know it might seem like a lot, but 2 gym sessions a week, focusing on compound lifts like squats, lunges, deadlifts, ideally with an emphasis on the single leg variant of it, because that will make you more resilient and more efficient. I know it seems like a lot, 2 sessions, but at least 1. And finally, you've got your recovery, and this is where the adaptations actually happen. Now, if you're cooked, yes, adjust for it, but don't skip hard work every time it feels uncomfortable. You need to learn the difference between fatigue and an actual injury. Sometimes you'll need to push through fatigue, but you don't want to try and push through an injury. And then it comes to race day. So I mentioned earlier that pacing is so important to make sure that you're staying aerobic for as long as possible. So the goal of the race is simple: even pacing or ever so slightly a negative split. There's tons of data from major marathons that consistently show that runners who negatively split, they finish faster and suffer less late race slowdown than those who go out too hard. And the number one mistake that I find that kills sub 4 attempts is going out too fast. So don't let that be you. Even 10 seconds a mile or 5 seconds a kilometer too quick early on, that can cost you minutes later down the road. Don't be tempted to try and bank time. You're spending energy that you're going to desperately need in those final 10K or so. It's often said that the race doesn't really start until around the halfway mark, and that's something that I really agree with. You want to run the first half thinking it was relatively easy, and what was all the fuss about? And that means that you're in a good position. You don't want to be hitting halfway and thinking, how am I going to make it to the end? So keep an eye on your speed and your heart rate, especially early on. Then those last 10K, just get your head down and give it all you got. If you're lucky enough to be in a big enough marathon, there's going to be some pacers there that will help runners pace their way to sub 4, sub 3:30, sub 3, and we call that the bus. So there'll be a lot of people on that 4-hour bus. So expect it to be quite busy with runners in and around you at that pace, but that could be a good option for you if you don't trust yourself to be able to stay sensible, because the pacer's job is to. So if the pacer runs well, they'll also help point out those water and fuel stops on the course as you approach them, because it's essential that you're taking on board fluids and as much energy as you can. And that's where fueling and hydration come in, and it's where so many runners lose that sub 4. And it's where good training blocks also fall apart. From a fueling standpoint, aim for between 60 to 90 grams of carbs per hour during the race and on those long, hard runs at the end of your block. So for most runners, that will look like a gel every 25 to 30 minutes or so. And you want to carry them with you on the day so that you're using that same brand that you've been using in your training. And that should be where you've been practicing in those long runs. So it might take a bit of trial and error, because some gels agree with people more than others. If you're trying to raw dog it on the long runs and you're not taking on board that fuel, you're not going to be able to train as well as you can. You're also not setting yourself up for success with your fueling on the day as well. Studies have actually shown that your performance drops sharply when that intake falls below or around 40 grams an hour, especially after that 2-hour mark. So make sure you're fueling up. For fluids, you want to target a minimum of 500 ml an hour. So for a sub 4 attempt, we're looking at around 2 liters over the course of the race. But for some, that might be slightly more, slightly less, depending on the conditions and how much you sweat. But for an example, a 2% drop in body weight, if you become dehydrated, that will start to show some pretty significant declines in your endurance performance. Also, your electrolytes matter too. You ideally want to be taking on 400 to 600 milligrams of sodium and ideally 100 to 200 milligrams of potassium an hour. That's slightly harder to get in. And that actually will help maintain your blood volume. It slows that cardiac drift and it reduces that cramping risk as well. And a good way to stay on top of that is instead of relying on what's on the course from those electrolyte cups, you actually can tape some salt tablets to your gels. And that will also remind you to take them at certain points in the race. And just like your fueling, make sure you're practicing that in your training too. And my final thoughts on why sub 4 is so worth it. So look, breaking 4 isn't about talent. It's about training smart so that you can actually race clever. Picture yourself crossing that line. You stop your watch and it reads at 3:59 or better. Now you didn't fluke it, you've earned it. So if you like this, hit the like, subscribe, and I've got another video for you right here that goes into the specifics of how you can structure your marathon training block. Ta-ra.